Welcome back to another podcast episode here on the channel. As you may be able to tell, I have been on the road traveling cross country this summer, but while I was in Lincoln ever so briefly, I got the opportunity to sit down with Pastor Matthew Lucio, who is out in the Illinois Conference of Seventh-day Adventists, but also runs the Seventh-day Adventist History Project, which has been tremendously helpful for me and many others in understanding what it means to be a Seventh-day Adventist, how we got to where we are today. I'm grateful to my friend Stephen for introducing me to this podcast, and I'm especially grateful for Pastor Matthew for sitting down with me, and I really hope you enjoy our good and somewhat brief conversation about Adventist history. All right, I am sitting here with a very special guest today who I have listened to for many hours. I don't know how many. I didn't calculate. But if you might as well introduce yourself and basically say who you are and why we're here.
All right. Well, my name is Matthew Lucio. I host the Adventist History Podcast, and I presume that's what you meant when you listened to me for many hours. You were not outside my house window, like listening in. All right. Just wanted to clarify that one for the record. But we're here on the campus of Union Adventist University, not Union College anymore.
I think my shirt still says Union College.
Oh, it's out of date. But yeah, absolutely. So we're here. We're with hanging out with Ellen White's pulpit.
Yep. If you didn't know, Ellen White used this pulpit when she preached at College View Church at least once, if not more than once. And you pastor an Illinois conference. I even see that on your shirt, right?
I do, although I'm switching to a different job.
Are you really?
Yeah, up at the conference office. I'm going to be the assistant to the president for communication in about 3 days.
Oh, wow. We caught him right in the transition mode.
Yeah, right.
Okay. So we'll start off with something really random.
Okay.
I saw a video you did about Adventist nudists. For anyone who didn't see that video, you got to mention it. It's too crazy to not mention.
Yeah. So there was a little storyline. I think our mutual friend Michael Campbell actually tipped me off to it.
Oh, did he really?
Yeah. He found the Adventist response to it. I think if I'm remembering the timeline here well. Michael, you can correct me if you remember it differently. But he found the response to it in the ministry, which, if you've watched the video, the response is very, very strong. Yeah. And so he pointed to where this nudist magazine is, and then I went and bought a few copies of it, which is a very fun thing to explain to your wife. Let me just tell you why you're ordering this. Yeah. It's especially offensive, not just because of nudity in these magazines, but because of they had no problem publishing pictures of nude children, which feels very transgressive these days. Like they're not able to give consent, right, and all these sort of things. So I'm donating those issues because I do not want them around my house, right? The police come in and they find that. Like I don't want that. It's for history. Anyways, what happened was there were some Adventist nudists, and so we're just trying to, in that video, unpack what their rationale was, why they thought Ellen White would approve of this, and then to express a healthy dose of skepticism about whether she would approve of this or not. Yeah. So
that gives us like a hyper-specific example of something in Adventist history. Yeah. But more generally, I am curious what it was that propelled you to start a podcast. Was it like 10 years ago? How long ago was it? I didn't realize that when I started listening to it. You did that for 10 years, and it's not quite done yet.
One more
episode?
There's always one more episode, then there's another and another and another. I thought we're wrapping up with talking about Desmond Ford. And we're in part 4 now. That's the last episode's been released. I thought it would only take 4 episodes. Turns out there's a lot more to the story than I had thought, so it's going to be maybe 6 or 7 episodes in the end, and then I will retire from podcasting and just worry about YouTube then at that point. Okay. So so it'll be a few more episodes. I'm going to go back and redo season 1 of the podcast. So when you were listening, when you started 10 years ago, audio quality is not as great. Yeah. And anyways, I learned a lot since then also. So it's I'm going to go back and kind of update those episodes a little bit. So it'll all sound about the same, and I'll be able to give more current information about it too. So
sure. And in the beginning, what was it that caused you in the first place to do this? Yeah, I'm curious about that.
Pastoring. Okay. so I started pastoring, and people started asking me questions. My members did about why do we do communion this way? Why is our church service this way? It was just casual questions. I was trained to deal with theological questions. Right. Why do we keep the Sabbath? What's the argument for the state of the dead? All that kind of stuff. I didn't know why we did communion the way we did it. And apologies if a seminary professor is watching. Maybe they did tell me. I don't know. But it just. So I found myself having to go back in the Adventist history to answer these questions. And the more I had to do that, the more I realized this is much more interesting than I thought it was going to be.
Yeah.
Which is why when people listen to the podcast and they tell me I thought it was going to be boring, but it was actually fun,
Yeah.
I resonate with that because that was my feeling about it too. When I became an Adventist, I had no interest in Adventist history because it was the thing that everybody in the church wanted to fight about. You know,
Sure.
Should we believe in the Trinity? Let's go back in the Adventist history and argue about it. Are we doing what Ellen White told us to do? Let's go back in the Adventist history and argue about it. And it was just like this was the thing that we argued over. So I'm like, that's not interesting. It's like a weapon. And if I go into Adventist history, then I'm going to have to pick a side. And I just didn't want anything to do with it. But anyways, when I was forced to go into it later on as a pastor, it's like, this is much more interesting than I thought. These are real people. It's not like Ellen White floating on the cloud with the halo above her head. She's a real person.
Yeah.
And I was really interested in the real people of Adventist history because I could relate to them.
Sure.
They're humans.
Yeah, it came at really good timing for me too because
Okay.
I just finished my sophomore year here at Union as a theology student, and I was taking the history of Seventh-day Adventist Church class. So my friend who had been telling me to watch this, I was like, well, now's the time. I'm about to take this class. So then I binged through like the whole thing while taking the class. So I was listening to your podcast. I was also reading one of George Knight's books,
of course,
the Development of Adventist Theology book that he did. There's so many different directions we could go with this.
Yeah.
But I do like how you talk about the people. And we were talking about before we started recording how you kind of just state what happened. You don't necessarily put a halo on somebody or take a side.
Yeah.
I think you mentioned that with Desmond Ford too. I'm not going to tell you whether I think Desmond Ford is right or not.
It's true. It's true.
And you're still not going to tell us.
I'm still not going to tell you. Yeah. Breaking news. I'm going to tell you right here, right now. This is the only place. No, wait. No.
All right.
No, I enjoy my job. And I'm not saying that because secretly I'm pro Ford. I really, the truth of the matter is, I mean what I say in that episode. I don't really care. Like, I don't want to go back to the 80s and refight a battle that was before I was born. Like,
Sure.
It's not. The people are much more interesting to me than debating the ideas. I guess the people. Some of the ideas, of course, are very interesting, but I'm not here to go back in time and fight their battles. We have enough problems today. Anyways, I apologize if listening to my podcast gave you a bad grade in that class. I hope George Knight was able to get it back up. Okay.
I did well. I had a lot of fun with it. I was similar experience to you where I wasn't sure if I was going to like it going into it.
Yeah.
I wasn't really even sure what I thought of my Adventism as somebody raised in the church.
Sure.
And I got to develop that.
Yeah.
And I like how you talked about the people. Another weird example that came to my mind, see if I can get this right. Ellen White went to a Samoan island. Was that the one that I'm thinking of? Can you tell us about that? I thought that was really funny.
Yes, when she was helped ashore.
Yes.
Because the boat couldn't go all the way to land. There wasn't a dock that it could pull in at. Oh, yeah, that was a story from a long time ago. Yes, and a very strapping man was able to carry her to shore, and she commented on his physique.
And his lack of clothing as well,
yes,
right?
his lack of clothing. Maybe she was in the Adventist nudism, Man, you're getting me to second guess this.
We're going to quote him on that, right?
No, the maybe is a very hypothetical maybe. That's my favorite Ellen White story. Just because it illustrates that she was a real person.
She was a person.
Right.
Yeah.
Like she noticed these things. It's not like she was so in the clouds that she had no idea if this guy had a shirt on or not.
Right.
Like she noticed he did not have a shirt on. Yeah, right. She's like, singing like,
Amazing
some
Grace.
hymns. Yeah, Amazing Grace while she's being carried to shore. She's a normal person. She notices these things, right?
Yeah.
We don't have to make too big of a deal about it, but she noticed it, and that's what helps me realize. Oh yeah, she's awesome. She's a human.
Yeah, and we learn a lot if we look at the history of the flaws of some people and how they even appear as flaws looking back.
Yeah.
Like one example comes to my mind is James White and his views kind of on the Trinity.
Sure.
We look today and we're like, whoa, he said that?
Yeah.
I found some in researching, I found some quotes of Adventists talking about the Trinity where they call it like a pagan monstrosity of papal power. And it's like, whoa, today we don't even question it. It's in our belief.
Yeah, I would say most of us don't question it. There's a minority of Adventists that still very much think we need to get back to the glory days. But this is really fun right now because on the issue of the Trinity, because you have these ex-Adventists or anti-Adventists on YouTube just blasting us for like, oh, you guys used to be Arians or semi-Arians. And then you have a minority of Adventists who are like, we need to get back to the glory days when we were Arian or semi-Arian. And it's like, the ex-Adventists are like, you guys are not really Trinitarian because look at your past. And then the minority of Adventists who are anti-Trinitarian are like, we are too Trinitarian now. We need to get back to when we were non-Trinitarian. It's like, I don't know who to believe here.
Too Trinitarian?
Okay, fair enough. It's like, we are Trinitarian and we need to get away from it. And the ex-Adventists are like, we're not really Trinitarian because of what James White and others believe.
Right.
You know, the interesting thing about that is, when you look at the reasons for why they were anti-Trinitarian, I think today we would disagree with the conclusions, like the being against the Trinity. But when you look at the reasons, a lot of times I think they just, in general, phenomenally misunderstood what the Trinity was, because their arguments against the Trinity are actually like they're trying to preserve the divinity of Christ.
Right, exactly.
Because they think for some odd reason. They confuse the Trinity with like modalism and other things. That's what they're really arguing against, and they're not realizing. I don't know how, but they're not realizing the Trinity was designed to fight against modalism. I don't know how they got to that conclusion, but I think the reasons for why they came to their conclusions, we can relate to. The actual conclusion is something we can struggle with. But
the reasoning was basically sola scriptura, wasn't it? Like, we got to get back to the Bible.
And
because the word Trinity isn't in the Bible, wasn't that part of the reasoning?
Yes, that was an argument. Yeah, you're right. Yeah, this is part of the whole larger restorationist thing where we're trying to get rid of the accretions that crept into the church over the centuries, like Sunday and you know. So what are the chances are that you're going to surgically like remove all the bad stuff but keep all the good stuff? I mean, it's a messy process. It's when you hit the reset button, you tend to lose the good with the bad, and hopefully over time you can get that good back. You can realize, oh, that was too much. Like I threw the baby out with the bathwater. I need the baby. Horrible example, because like what does that mean in this case? You jump out the window and grab the baby? I don't know. Metaphor breaks down, but you get the idea.
I heard some quote. I'll have to put it on the screen. I don't remember who said it, but it was, "Don't be careful before you throw the baby out with the bathwater, because the baby is holy." And sometimes we can throw things out, intending with good intentions, and
definitely. And we're expected to learn from this stuff. I think we're expected to realize, oh, okay, that's too far. We should be reflecting on our past actions and words and things like that, and make adjustments as we go. Like, we're human too.
You know, I am curious, and we'll see how far this conversation can go. But you don't often express your personal take on most things in the podcast, right?
Most things.
And I'm guessing that's intentional?
Yeah.
So like, if somebody were to ask you a loaded question like, what is an Adventist? How would you even respond to that, or would you even respond to that?
Funny you mentioned that. So I'm here right now. I'm going to be speaking at camp meeting tonight and tomorrow night. And tomorrow night I'm going to be talking about what an Adventist is.
Oh, are you really?
This is a great commercial. What a segue. Come to camp meeting in Kansas, Nebraska. Of course, by the time this is posted,
by the time this stuff is probably
over. You're too late.
Watch the live streams of the camp meeting from Kansas, Nebraska.
Right. That's the $1 million question in Adventism right now, and I don't know. You ask 50 different people, you'll get 20 different answers.
At least.
Yeah. So what does it mean to be an Adventist? I don't know. I think we have thoroughly deconstructed Adventism, and I think that's the natural question. Is like, okay, now what remains? What's left? We just have a pile of rubble. What is it useful for? So. I don't know. I mean, I have my own opinions on the matter. It doesn't really matter what I think. I just want to get people to ask the question, and then we can work together towards the answer. So that's my cop-out answer. Right?
So in other words, he's not going to answer the question.
I mean, I can. I just it's something that is difficult. It is because you can spend an hour, you can spend a day, you can spend a year studying this and talking about, because I can say, what is an Adventist, but then somebody can say, well, that seems to describe Anglo-Adventism in North America. What about Adventism, for other peoples around the world? Like, is there a difference? All I'll say is this. Here's my general answer to that question. So in the beginning, Adventism was a coalition of Christians who believed Jesus was coming soon. And all other beliefs were subsumed under that one belief.
Yeah.
That's the thing that brought us together. Now, over time, in the 1840s, we added Sabbath and sanctuary and these other things to it. So now we had a handful of beliefs that brought us together. Otherwise, you could be as diverse as you want. You can believe whatever you want about trumpets. You can believe whatever you want about seals. And then over time, of course, we're like establishing interpretations of those things too. So what it means to be an Adventist in 1844 was different than 1850, was different than 1863, because suddenly now we're incorporated as a church, and to be an Adventist kind of means to, you should officially belong. So now there's like an official, are you in or out of the organization, right? So that's an aspect of it too. But anyways, the point is like these things just accrue over time. So being an Adventist, there's a cultural identity.
Haystacks,
right? If you tell me you go to church on Sabbath and you believe in, the non-immortality of the soul and Ellen White's a prophet, and then I say, hey, are you coming to camp meeting? You're like, what's that? And I'm like, oh, it's a place we come and we hear sermons, we sing, and we have haystacks. And you're like, what are haystacks? I'm going to start wondering, is this person really an Adventist? Even though theologically you may agree with the Adventist, I guess the distinctives. Culturally, you're not an Adventist, right? Because it's like, how do you not know what these things are? So there's a theological definition of Adventism, a cultural one, and that cultural one can change, right? Different places. So anyways, there's different ways of looking at identity. That's why it's such a hard question to answer. Because when you say what is an Adventist, it's like saying what is an American?
Right.
How do you define that?
Yeah.
Were you born here? What about people who are naturalized?
Yeah.
Okay. What about a cultural meaning? Like, what if you ascribe or aspire to the values in the Declaration of Independence and you respect the Constitution, even if you're not a citizen? Are you still an American in a sense? So again, that's why it's so hard to answer. It's like we could have that conversation all day long.
Well, and any way you or I answer it is going to make somebody upset.
It's going to make
because it's part of our identity.
Yeah.
And if you disagree with part of somebody's identity, it's going to.
And I think because the part of the problem is I'm going to define Adventism as I see in the mirror, basically.
Right.
Because I look at myself, I'm like, shouldn't I be the definition of Adventism? Shouldn't my experience, my history, my beliefs, my practices, shouldn't that be like normative for everybody else? That's our bias. That's our bias as human beings. Like we think our experience should be normative for others. And that's why it's such a hard conversation to have, because maybe I'm really wrong.
Well, I think that's actually something interesting that I've observed is I think at the good times in Adventism, at least, there's a certain willingness to be wrong a little bit.
Yeah.
And I feel like that at least should be maybe part of what it is. Obviously, we're not going to be like, well, maybe there's room for atheism in Adventism.
Right, yeah.
But I feel like there has been room for development and growth within Adventist history, with the Trinity, for example, and things like that. We've changed.
Yeah.
And there's over time there's been a willingness to accept that overall.
Yeah. But the genius, and that's not just Adventists, but the genius of an organization is to be able to change all the time while claiming that they are consistent.
Yeah.
Right? Like the ethos of Apple has changed tremendously from the early 80s when Steve Jobs managed the Mac team, with Lisa and all that, and he raised the pirate flag on the campus in Cupertino to indicate my team, we're rebelling against the world, we're the underdogs. Right. Apple is not the underdog.
This is Apple, that's Apple. It's not the underdogs anymore.
Right. They're not the underdogs anymore. Yeah. But they can still give off that vibe. Right? It's it's creativity against the world, it's only Apple can do this, because we think different, but it's every iPhone looks the same now. You know what I mean? There's no thinking different anymore.
Yeah, that's true.
So Adventism too gets to portray this idea of we are still the people from 1844, and yet you look at it and you're like, we have changed tremendously. Tremendously in some areas. But that's the genius of organizations, to change, but tell people we haven't changed.
Well, and there's truth to that too. Growing up, I grew up in Adventist school from kindergarten all the way until college. I'm still in an Adventist university. I never really knew that there was a time where Adventists didn't believe in the Trinity until a couple years ago.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's not something we teach. We don't go around flaunting. Look, we changed our belief on this. Yeah, it's not something we do.
Right. Yeah, but going back to your earlier point about not being afraid to be wrong.
Sure. Yeah.
I feel like a movement born out of 1844. I love the humility that ought to come out of that. That, hey, we started this whole thing off by being wrong. Like we're fallible. Like we can make mistakes.
Yeah.
We're dependent on the Lord to give us light because we as human beings are not going to figure it all out on our own.
Right.
And I love that. And that should make us the humblest people on all the earth. And we're very proud of that.
Right. You catch that? We're proud of our humility, ladies and gentlemen.
We're proud of our humility.
Yeah, something I've noticed in my study, I was telling you how I had read Questions on Doctrine, which is a long book, by the way.
Insane to read that whole book.
But there's something that I worry about when we talk about our Adventism and debate our Adventism. Sometimes we can forget that we're Christians, I feel like. Because if we get so caught up in our Adventist doctrine, we forget Christ.
Yeah.
Do you share that sentiment?
Yeah. Oh, I mean, that's our Achilles heel as Adventists.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because we think Adventism is like Christianity 2.0. Right? We're better. We're better than other Christians.
We're the better Christians.
We are. We're the one true remnant people.
Oh, yeah.
And of course, we're not saying that like intentionally to be arrogant.
No.
But it's the idea of we have restored these lost truths that other churches have left behind by the grace of God. Okay.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, like you can't just go back to mere Christianity, I guess, to borrow a Lewis phrase.
C.S. Lewis, yeah.
You can't go back to mere Christianity because Adventist Christianity is supposed to be superior. And that creates a tension because we tend to define Adventism by its distinctives, not by its what it has in common with fellow Christians.
Sure. Good point.
And so when we get called a cult, a word that I absolutely detest, I hate it.
Yeah.
But to a certain extent, we've kind of brought it on ourselves. Because we just drive the differences so hard that people are like, well, then you really are different. And not in a positive way, right? In a way that you've lost sight of Christ. And that's not the way we want to be different. And obviously the last, half century or so, there's been a strong push to be like, no, we need to keep Christ in our Adventism, right? But it's hard to kick against tradition.
Yes.
Yeah. And it's hard. So
I find that it's interesting you bring up C.S. Lewis too, because sometimes I feel like as an Adventist, I'm like, I'm reading a lot of non-Adventist books. Am I really Adventist?
Yeah.
Because Mere Christianity is one of my favorite books.
Sure.
For sure. Other heroes of mine like Lee Strobel and these guys who are non-Adventist Christians. But I feel when I read them, I share much more in common than I do different.
Yeah.
But sometimes we forget that and we think, oh, hey, C.S. Lewis, he didn't believe in soul sleep. He didn't believe in Sabbath.
Right. Yeah, and we can feel superior to all of these people, no matter how brilliant they were, because they were deficient in Sabbath or stay dead or whatever. But it's like, I don't know. When we realize we didn't invent the Sabbath, we got it from the Seventh-day Baptists. Right? We didn't invent quarterly communion. We didn't even invent this idea of the moral government of God, which is kind of the seed for the great controversy. Like, we did not invent these things. The only thing that we really truly invented was the sanctuary.
Yeah.
The idea of a prophet. Did not invent that. She's not even the only prophet in the 1800s. Right? So I think when we realize we've borrowed from other churches truth that they had, I think that should help us to realize we don't have all the truth. Like, we would have one truth if it was up to us to create it.
Yeah.
Everything else we borrowed. And we modified, obviously. So
then, in other words, we're going to be investigative judgment Christians now, because we're going to hold on to that one thing.
Yeah, right. Yeah, but I mean, we have something to learn from other Christians. That's the whole point.
Yeah.
Right? If we didn't have anything to learn, we wouldn't be where we are. We wouldn't be anything. We'd be a one doctrine people. So, I think some humility of like, we have something to teach and we have something to learn is important to keep in mind.
Sure. There's so many directions we can go with this conversation, and I could keep going. If you ask anybody who I know personally, lately it's been a very common topic of conversation. People get tired of it. It's one of the reasons I wanted to sit down. I'm like, I know I can nerd out in this case.
That's right.
But if we were, as we close out, is there anything specific that you think is like the most important takeaway from studying Adventist history? Something that you would leave with whoever's listening to this? I know that's a loaded thing, but I like to ask people loaded questions.
All right, you've come to the mountaintop to learn the one pearl of wisdom about Adventist history from one such as I. I think the thing is, it doesn't really matter. Nothing matters unless you actually read it or digest Adventist history for yourself. We say read, but obviously there's podcasts now, and there's other ways of getting Adventist history. You can watch it. There's movies. There's documentaries. Whatever. So read is just like a catch-all term for all of that. But just read it. Just read it for yourselves, because I think the greatest crisis we face right now is that question of Adventist identity. And without history, then that means we are free to make up whatever we want. Why can't an Adventist be a Sunday-keeping, once saved, always saved, rapture-believing papist? Why can't Adventist mean that? Why can't we just stretch the word to make it mean whatever we want? Because it has historical meaning. And while the historical meaning does change over time, of course, it's not like a one thing, just like being an American in 1776 is different than being an American in 2024. That meaning, it changes, it stretches, it constricts over time. It can't mean anything. An American cannot mean a Soviet Russian, right? There are limits to it. And so I think as we contemplate our Adventist identity, history is absolutely crucial to figuring that out, because we need to go back, retrace our steps, and figure out, okay, what does that Adventist identity over time look like? Why did we go this way and not this way? What would it meant if we have gone? That's where the interesting conversations are, I think. And I think this is where we're going to find a large part of our answer of what it means to be an Adventist today. We can't be historically ignorant and have that conversation. That's what I mean.
Wow.
So go read Adventist history. That's all I'm going to say.
Go read it. Go read it. Or listen to it. Listen to his podcast. It's a great podcast. I highly recommend it. And I want to really thank you for sitting down with me. I really appreciate it. And go check out that podcast. Go read Adventist material. And God bless.
All right. Thanks for having me.